Hello, everyone. Attorney Craig Steger here. So, here for another live show. It is Monday, December 16th, and I'm a few minutes late. Has been my habit. I try to start around 4:30 p.m. Central Time, about 5 minutes late, but I'm here, and I hope that um, some of you will show up at some point during the live stream and ask any questions that you have. Today's topic is again insurance, and specifically what happens if you have a fire and you find out after the fact that you don't have the right insurance or enough insurance. I see these types of situations enough that I wanted to talk about it today. As usual, before we begin, I just want to point out that this live stream is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Viewing or participating in this live stream does not create an attorney-client relationship. You should always consult with an attorney that practices in the state where you're at and handles these kinds of cases. I only work in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa, and so I can answer questions specifically about those states. But you should always talk to an attorney if you have any specific questions. You can always leave a comment, and if I'm able to answer it, I will. And if not, I may try. Maybe I'll do a video later on if it requires more than a comment. So, with that in mind, let me get started. So, this afternoon, actually, I'm still working on it. I'm drafting pleadings, the complaint that begins a lawsuit for a person who had a fire that destroyed an outbuilding on their property and a bunch of their personal contents, tools, tractors, lawn tools and equipment, stuff like that. And structural fires, especially if it's not your dwelling. So, if it's an outbuilding of some sort that's not attached to your home, you should pay special attention to this video because I or other lawyers that I work with have had a number of cases where a fire, maybe wind or something, tornado, but fire damages an outbuilding. And depending on the type of insurance policy that you have, there may or may not be coverage for it. And here's a common example. Um, this is not an exhaustive list, but let's say there are three common types of kind of rural real estate liability policies. Number one might be a homeowner's policy. And this might be the same policy that you would have if you own your house and live in the city. So, a homeowner's policy, a country estate policy, and a farm policy. There's some similarities to these different insurance policies, and then there are some significant differences. And maybe the easiest way to understand is the difference between a homeowner's policy and a farm policy. A homeowner's policy is primarily protecting the home itself and any attachments to it. Your garage, your attached garage, and your possessions are typically going to be covered by a homeowner's policy, subject to the particular exclusions or terms of the policy, coverage limits, things like that. And a homeowner's liability policy will typically provide liability coverage to you. So let's say someone comes over and visits you, and let's say they trip over an uneven spot on the floor. You've known about it, and you just never got around to fixing it, and they trip and fall and they get hurt. They make a claim against you and your insurance company. Your homeowner's policy should provide liability protection to you, which means that if someone else gets hurt while they're on your property and they have to sue you, your homeowner's policy should provide attorneys to defend you, should pay the claim up to the policy limits, things like that. And that is sort of the two key functions of a homeowner's policy are to provide that type of liability protection, which actually can carry with you even if you're not at home. I've talked about that in other live streams, but um, primarily it's there. It's a liability protection for visitors and people that come to visit you at your home and get injured for some reason, particularly if they claim the injury was because you were negligent or careless in your maintenance and upkeep, or maybe even the design of your home. That's number one. And then number two is protecting the dwelling, the structure itself, for things such as fire, storm damage, um, may or may not provide flooding coverage, depending on whether you're in a flood zone or not and what kind of coverage you have. But let's say tornadoes and fires are, let's say, the most common types of and wind, hail, damage that can be done to your home because of Mother Nature, and your homeowner's policy, if you have the correct coverage, is there to help pay for any repairs, or if it can't be repaired, the cost of disposing of the of what's left, and then building a different house, as well as maybe some living costs in between the time of the fire or the windstorm, and when you can actually move back in. So that's kind of, for most people, that's your homeowner's policy. That's what it does. A farm policy kind of does all those things, but then does a lot more things, primarily related to liability, because with farming, depending on the type of farming you do, there may be liability associated with that, and there can be a lot more stuff to insure. So let's say you're a dairy farmer, you have you may have a lot of money, a lot of assets wrapped up in your barn, in your sheds, whatever you do to house your cattle, silos and bunkers and things like that for storing feed, equipment, tractors, wagons, skid steers, all that kind of stuff. As well as, if someone claims that you sold tainted milk and they get sick, that kind of liability coverage tends to come with a farm policy. It could include if someone is out on your land and they get injured because they claim that you, I don't didn't maintain a trail correct or something like that. Who knows? Or let's say you have livestock and they run out on the road and they cause a crash, or your horse gets out and goes out and runs someone over. That kind of stuff can be the type of stuff, the liability stuff, that's covered by a farm policy, as well as, let's say, the same type of protection and coverage for your buildings. If there's a fire, someone near us recently had a fire break out in their machine shed. They're dairy farmers, and the whole thing went up. All the tractors, wagons, all that kind of stuff burnt very quickly, tools and things like that. Insurance company came in and paid, and they had the Amish put up another shed like within a week or 2 weeks, and then you start replacing equipment and stuff like that. So that's a farm policy, right? And then sort of the intermediate is, let's say, it's a country estate. It may have, or an acreage policy, may go by different names, and it's a little bit of both. You're not a full-scale farming operation. You're not really in the business of farming, but because you live in the country, you may have, let's say, maybe you have a horse or some dogs, or you may have a tractor or ATVs and things like that, that both need property coverage, as maybe there's a loan on it. Maybe you bought a tractor and you're making payments on it. The bank may require to have insurance coverage on that. ATVs, things like that, or maybe, that's where you may need something more than homeowner's policy if you live in the country, but maybe you don't need a farm policy. Okay. That's, in very general terms, kind of how you can look at those different policies. And typically, again, this is where it's really important to know your insurance policy, talk to your insurance agent, ask them questions, because policies can vary greatly. Insurance companies can vary greatly in the types of coverage they have, the types of exclusions they have. States may have very different rules about what kind of coverage you have, but I'm just talking broadly speaking in, let's say, the Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa, where I work. Um, so what happens then if you have outbuildings? And let's say you have your house in your garage, but then let's say you have a detached pole barn, and out in the pole barn is where you keep your boat and your tractor and snow blower and your ATV, and maybe you got a fishing boat in there, and your tools. Maybe you park an old vehicle in there, those kinds of things. What happens when that burns down? And that's really something that people need to pay attention to, because as a general matter, stuff that's attached to the home is going to have much better coverage for both the structure as well as personal items that get destroyed in a fire if they're part of the house or attached to it. On the other hand, if they're in buildings outside of that, especially if it's not a homeowner's policy, generally speaking, the insurance companies require a much more detailed list and values of the things that you have in there and what you want to have covered. You may have to specifically list a tractor or a four-wheeler or a boat if it's in a building not attached to the house as opposed to something attached to the house. And it may also be different if it's a homeowner's policy as opposed to a farm or a country estate policy. Okay. So those are things, especially if you live in the country and you have outbuildings and you have, things of value, especially if you have loans on them and things like that. But, just imagine yourself if you have a building at all, you have a shop and it's full of tools and hunting and fishing equipment and stuff like that. If that burned down, would you be able to replace all that? And do you think your insurance covers that? Those are the kinds of questions that's really, really important to have with insurance agents before a fire happens, not after. Keep a list of all the items. You have digital, cameras on your phones. Take picture and video of everything. It can make it much easier after the fact to remember things. But what happens if you have a fire and you submit your claim and you find out, oh, by the way, we don't cover this because it wasn't in the garage attached to the house? Well, it may depend on what went on beforehand. Do you have an insurance agent that you work with? Did you ask them to insure the boat or the tractor or the ATV? What kind of communications did you have? What kind of applications did they have you fill out? That stuff becomes very, very important. Do you send them an email as opposed to calling them when, let's say, you add a new piece of equipment? Those things can be really, really important after the fact if you believed you have had insurance coverage when in fact you may not. So when those things happen, it's common for me to get involved, and sometimes I have to start a lawsuit like I'm getting ready to now. And I may be so some of the people that may be sued are the insurance agent. If the insurance agent dropped the ball somehow, maybe you filled out an application. They say, "Oh, yep, I'll get you that coverage," and then they forget to submit it to the insurance company, or they check the wrong box, or they you know somehow they make a mistake in the policy. That is one situation where the agent knew what kind of coverage you wanted, tried to get it, and then they just made a mistake. That is one that is one approach that may be able to be taken, and it may bind the insurance company to them, depending on the state and depending on the terms of the policy, and more importantly, depending on the relationship between the insurance company and the agent. There's different kinds of agents. Some agents are what we call captive agents. Captive agents only write insurance for certain insurance companies. Others are independent agents and they can write policies for all kinds of insurance companies. The captive agents, generally speaking, are more likely to bind the insurance company if they make mistakes than independent agents. Okay. Something to keep in mind when you're dealing with this is to know what kind of insurance company you have and what kind of relationship they have with their agents. Are they captive agents or are they independent agents? So there may be a situation where the agent knew what they were supposed to do and they just forgot to do it, or they signed the wrong paperwork, or they made a mistake. There may be ways to rectify that. You may be able to reform the insurance policy. So the insurance company, which may not have been aware of any of this, can actually have the insurance policy reformed to reflect the coverage that you were supposed to have. Again, depends on a lot of circumstances that I just got done talking about. You may have a claim against the agent for negligence. We call that errors and omissions. They made a professional mistake, and there may be a claim against them and their own insurance company. They may have errors and omissions or professional liability insurance for their own mistakes. So there may be a claim of negligence against the agent. There may also be a claim against the insurance company for pure breach of contract, and that could be as simple as, yeah, I had a loss and you didn't pay me everything that I'm entitled to under the policy. Not even trying to reform the policy or change the policy, but even under the policy that I had, you haven't paid for everything that I'm entitled to. So that would be a breach of contract in most states. There may be other claims. There may be allegations of fraud. There may be some trade or like deceptive trade practices laws, depending on the state. There may be some equitable claims like unjust enrichment, estoppel, things like that. But the three that I kind of talked about, negligence, breach of contract, or reformations, are the ones that I see most often and the ones that I most often resort to when I'm starting a lawsuit for someone. One thing to keep in mind, and again, this varies greatly by state, but recognize that these kinds of claims are often subject to a much shorter statute of limitations, a much shorter legal deadline than other claims for things such as personal injuries. For example, here in Wisconsin, personal injury claims can be brought within 3 years, but claims against a fire policy for property damage may have to be brought within 1 year. And so there, and that I have found that to be common in other states as well, such as Iowa and Minnesota, where the deadline to bring legal action for fire losses and wind losses and storm damage, if it's for property, tends to be much shorter than the personal injury. So that's oftentimes a year, maybe even less. So it's really, really important not to wait around. If you have a claim against the insurance company or your agent, if you didn't get the insurance coverage that you thought you were getting or wanted to have or whatever, um, a couple caveats. At least in Wisconsin, it is really, really difficult to establish negligence of an insurance agent. I've had many clients over time who have found out they didn't have as much insurance as they should have had. And it can take something as much as I call my agent or I write my agent and said, "Hey, I need you to raise my auto insurance limits from $150,000 to $300,000." Let's say you've watched one of my other videos on Wisconsin's sponsorship statute for auto insurance liability for parents, and you say, "Hey, I need that," and your agent says, "Yep, we'll get it in," and they forget to do it. And let's say, God forbid, one of your children gets involved in a crash. That type of circumstance may be enough to hold the agent and or the insurance company responsible. But let's say it's a little different situation. Let's say you've had a long-standing relationship with your insurance agent. Let's say you've always had $150,000 in liability insurance. You say, "Hey, agent, my oldest child is turning 16. They're getting their license. Can you add them to our policies?" Like, "Sure thing. I'll add you to the policy. they're now covered for the same $150,000. Let's say the agent doesn't know that in Wisconsin, at least, there's sponsorship liability up to $300,000 and fails to tell you, oh, by the way, you should really increase your limits. That may not be enough in Wisconsin, at least, to hold the agent liable because the standard for agent negligence is pretty high. Again, this varies a lot by state and circumstance, but it's something to keep in mind. This is why it's really this is one of the reasons I do a lot of the videos I do on insurance is it's much better, much easier to be proactive about your insurance. Talk to your agents in advance, schedule a meeting, have them explain in great detail what your coverages are, and ask questions such as, hey, if my 17-year-old son or daughter causes a crash and injures someone badly, how much insurance do I have? If my pole barn burns down because it gets struck by lightning and destroys everything in it, what kind of coverage do I have? Are the items in it covered? Do I need to make a list? Do I need photographs? Those are the kinds of things that is really important to ask insurance agents beforehand as opposed to after the fact. And if possible, to have that in writing. Could be an email. You could drop a letter off, something along those lines. But those are things that it's really beneficial to be educating yourself and asking the questions that you need to before a loss occurs as opposed to after the fact when we're trying to fix a bad situation is what we're trying to do, because the law can be not very favorable to these kinds of efforts to try and fix insurance, change insurance after a loss has already happened. Let me check my notes here. I think that's what I wanted to cover, but let me check here real quick. Da, 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 da. Obviously, if an agent misstates or misrepresents what kind of coverage you have, that can be important. It's important to note that insurance policies can have some pretty important exclusions and terms that really limit your coverage. And this is why, as difficult as and unpleasant as it may be, it's important to actually go through and read your insurance policy. And more importantly, if you have any questions, submit those questions in writing to your agent and get answers on those. And if they ignore you, persist, follow up with them, and get answers to your questions and get those answers in writing. Let's see. Yeah, a few other things to keep in mind. Keep receipts. So if you have a fire loss, you have a storm damage, and have to go out and buy stuff, keep receipts of everything. If you have to stay in a hotel, let's say you have to stay in a hotel while your house is being repaired, keep those receipts, keep your food receipts, keep all of those receipts, keep a nice list, pictures if necessary to help document that. Really important to do that. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to cover today. I hope that answers some of the questions that people have. These are some of the common things that I see come up in my practice, and I always try to help people avoid problems beforehand so that they don't need to come hire me after the fact, because it's just so much easier to fix insurance problems before a loss happens rather than after a loss happens. So if people have any questions about that, if there is anything that was not clear and you want to leave a comment, I'm happy to try and answer that if I can. If you have a specific question about a case, it's best not to leave a comment. It's best to reach out to me. You can get on my calendar. You can also call or text me at any time. My phone number is on here. And my contact information should be in the description if you want to send me an email. So if you have a specific legal need and it involves Wisconsin or Minnesota or Iowa, feel free to reach out to me. If I can help you, I will. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I appreciate everyone who was in on the chat and more on the live stream, and more importantly, anyone who might see this after the fact. So appreciate you watching. And until next time, everyone, have a good